The NES and its games have consistently impressed me over the many years I've been enjoying the console. In a sea of experiences that are touted as NES hard, I've encountered quite a few that break from that tradition and are actually very approachable for the average gamer. What we'll discuss here are not only enjoyable titles, but a short list of games I feel that developers actually wanted people to see the end of. Here we go. The first time I saw some gameplay of Little Samson, I knew it was inevitable that I'd fall in love with it. I really gravitate towards games where exploration is a central part of the experience, especially when it involves characters with special abilities. Thinking about how to approach different obstacles or enemies calls to mind games like Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap on the Master System or Euphoria on the Famicom, both of which I had a blast with. Little Samson doesn't take place in a continuous open world like these ones do, but I would easily place it near the top of a favorites list for the NES. The only thing wrong with it is that it was over too soon. Something this title does really well is setting players up for success right from the start. The first few stages are carefully crafted for each of the 4 playable characters, showing off their capabilities and allowing for some low-stakes experimentation. There's plenty of time to get a feel for their movement speeds and jumping heights, their spectrum of fighting power, and most importantly, how each of them uniquely interact with the environment. By the time this tutorial part wound down and the real game started, I was armed with plenty of solutions around how to tackle pretty much anything the game tossed in my direction. Also, shout out to the manual for combining this character information alongside some beautiful storytelling. Definitely check out the bios if you want a mildly deeper experience here. Anyway, the stages here are pretty long compared to some of the other titles on this list, but a lot of frustrations dissolved away from simply having 4 entire health bars to work with. When learning a new stage, even if 3 of the 4 characters had exploded out of existence, it was still possible to press on a little further with whoever was left and learn a bit more. There's also quite a bit of flexibility in the level design that fosters creativity and affords a more forgiving atmosphere. Half the fun of this game is figuring out how to get from point A to point B, and in many cases, you're not locked into using one specific character for any particular puzzle. Being able to rely on a couple of your pals to get through a prickly part of the stage meant that there was wiggle room for mistakes, making progress less dependent on perfection than other games. That's not to say that there's no challenge here, because there are certainly aspects of some stages that took some repeating to get through. I just appreciated that there was more than one answer and that I didn't have to keep every single character alive to be able to beat a stage for the majority of the game. Unlimited continues also helped to smooth out the tribulations of later levels that required more of a trial and error approach to get through. While I feel the character control was generally good, there were quite a few moments where I tried to do regular things like cling to walls or ceilings, only to fall to my doom instead through no fault of my own. Being able to continue from the beginning of this stage in question, rather than going back to the beginning of the game, felt like a fair way to counteract some of the fiddliness with these controls. This helped to make the experience feel balanced rather than ruthless. Without some of these features, Little Samson could easily become a very difficult jaunt on the NES. The people who made this game clearly knew what they were doing. I was a near religious watcher of Bugs Bunny as a kid. I rented a few of the Tiny Toons titles for the Sega Genesis, but since I never got the chance to rent much in the way of NES stuff, I missed out on all of the Looney Tunes games for the system. Bugs Bunny's Birthday Blowout has a hilarious premise where Bugs has been invited to a party to celebrate his 50th birthday, but his friends are so jealous of his party that they'd rather see him dead than arrive at the festivities. At least that's how it seems anyway, since everyone you've ever known wants to fight you. If I'm being completely honest here, my first impressions of this one were a bit shaky. The blinky frame rate and the jerky character movement were concerning, to say the least. Once I bit the bullet, it didn't take too long to get into the fun, since this entire experience was a bizarre foray in what can only be described as a world of nonsense. There's really not much here from the cartoons outside of the boss encounters, with most of the stages being packed full of eclectic foes. There are walking time bombs, malicious mallets, and soapboxes straight out of the dusty corners of someone's imagination, but the weirdest by far were these stoplight worms. They changed colors so you could pass through them sometimes, though I'd really like to know which region uses blue for their traffic signals. You have the ability to attack enemies with this pitiful mallet swing, but it was actually easier just to avoid them altogether. Bugs' movement is floaty and easy to maneuver in midair, which made coasting around enemies really smooth. Oddly, lots of them could be stood upon without incurring any damage, so being up in the air as often as possible was advantageous in conserving health. As long as you were coming straight down onto these weird little contraptions, you were good to go. It was actually really fun playing through the stages as they became increasingly maze-like. At the beginning, they're nice and straightforward, but as the game progresses, diving into various things like chimneys, tree trunks, barrels, and the like to reach new areas became a must. There are lots of dead ends, and some passages that loop you back to earlier parts of the level, infusing some much-needed range into the gameplay formula. This was only some artificial length padding, since being forced through the stage obstacles, sometimes multiple times, wasn't all that tough. This game is made up of all the same kinds of tricks that all platformers seem to have up their sleeves. Conveyor belts and falling platforms are staples here, along with rogue icicles and boulders in the more climate-centric stages. None of these pose much of an issue though, especially with how far that jump carries you. Even though I felt like I was dying a lot, I somehow gathered up more lives than I knew what to do with. There are a couple of mini-games between stages where gambling carrots can net you a whole bunch of lives at once. The one where you smoke Willy the Weasel with a mallet was my favorite since it's just a reimagining of Whack-A-Mole. When I was approaching the end of the game for the first time, I had over 25 lives left with no worries in the world that I'd game over. If carrying that many lives on a first playthrough doesn't speak to Birthday Blowout's breeziness, I don't know what does. Actually, yes I do. The boss fights are child's play. This is where all of your favorite characters from the cartoon come out of the woodwork, and all they do is menacingly walk back and forth at the bottom of the screen. Occasionally, they shoot something at you, maybe. The only hard thing about these encounters was the janky hitbox and trying to figure out how to actually hurt them, since it wasn't always easy to tell if hits were landing properly. They usually died in a few bops, and sometimes you didn't even need to hit them at all. If you ran into Daffy, all you had to do was grab your carrot and float away to a new area. Yay! It's obvious who the intended audience for this one was, but whether you're a fan of the shows or just really enjoy a casual platformer, this rabbit hole doesn't go very deep. Kabuki Quantum Fighter was one of those titles I kept seeing pop up on cheap NES game lists about a decade ago. It's an action platformer where you whip people to death with a long head of hair. You play as a soldier who volunteers to have his consciousness experimentally transmitted into his country's main defense computer to save it from hackers. For some reason, once he's in there, he's transformed into a hair-wielding Kabuki who garners aid from a team on the outside in the good fight against evil. It's weird, but it's also wonderful. When I first started playing this one, there were a few things that led me to believe that I was going to be in for a rough time. For one, the level design can be really annoying, like in some of the vertical stages where missing a jump meant falling for what felt like forever. Actually, hitting enemies wasn't the easiest to get the hang of either. If you were targeting at close range, the delivery had to land perfectly to connect. There were quite a few times when enemies got right up in my face, and there was nothing that I could do other than eat some damage or back off. The limited continues were also worrisome, but it only took a handful of attempts before this game was getting smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. The things that made Kabuki Quantum Fighter feel easy far outweighed its difficulties, with the biggest benefit being the enormous health bar. It took a lot of getting ping-ponged around by enemies to burn through it, even though the life bar was consistently getting shaved down by surprise pitfalls and pointy implements scattered around the stages. I can't tell you the number of times I asked out loud what had hit me. The culprits were usually blocks looming in the ceiling or floor with subtle spikes on them. These blended in so well that it was hard to notice them even while scouring the screen. On the bright side, enemies dropped hearts often to refill that stolen health. It was pretty rare to make it through a new stage on the first attempt, but having all that extra health around was a crucial advantage. What really tipped the scales was an extremely useful move that can only be deployed during boss fights. If you pause during the fray, you can actually exchange some of your chip meter for more life. This was huge while learning new boss patterns. I'd often arrive to one of these scuffles barely clinging to life. Being able to sidestep death this way granted a few more precious moments to observe the fight before getting wrecked, which made future attempts that much more foolproof. There aren't too many platformers I can think of that give you the option to heal right in the moment like this. The great character controls made some very technical level layouts a lot easier to maneuver through. Stages are designed around jumping and swinging, both of which feel almost perfect. There are so many games where the main character is sluggish and unresponsive, where foes and their projectiles can outrun you even if you're doing everything right. There was none of that here, but if I had to choose one gripe, it's how many frames of animation the main character has while jumping up to a platform from a hanging position. This made areas with tight timing extra tough to get through, like this one part with the fireballs. They knock you down if you're not fast enough, and despite my best efforts, I never quite mastered the timing to get through this section without taking damage. Thank goodness for that huge health bar. Another tick on the game's niceness list is the short stage length. While there's a lot to do in them, especially towards the back half of the game, they're actually not that hard to work through once you've figured out where to go and where all the trouble spots are. Without a lot of exploration to do here, and with most enemies going down in only a couple of hits, there's a steady feeling of making progress with each attempt. This is a great sign of a balanced and overall well-designed game. If you thought an NES title where someone goes inside of a computer to reclaim it from hijackers was a far-out plot, it might be even stranger to learn that there's a second game on this very list with a virtually identical backstory, but with a little less focus on hair. Power Blade is a platformer featuring one of the most enthusiastic-looking protagonist walk cycles I've ever seen in a video game. You get to power walk your way through several stages that you can play in any order, but one of the main features here is exploration. In each level, you'll have to track down a contact that'll grant you an ID card, giving you access to a boss fight and the next area. The level layouts are maze-like, and I honestly think I got really lucky during my first playthrough. Every stage has a few branching paths to check out, and I somehow avoided ending up at the exit door without the keycard the majority of the time. There are probably plenty of people out there that accidentally found the exit first and had to backtrack to find the informant, but considering how compact the levels are, it wasn't really a horrible problem to have. One thing that might have made an error like this a lot more frustrating is a tight timer, but Power Blade provides ample time per stage. I'd even dare to say that there's too much time given. I never even came close to walking the clock down completely, and that's saying something for a first playthrough where I had no idea where to go. Another thing that made the game feel breezy was how dynamic the main weapon was to use. You can aim the boomerang in 8 different directions, which is not super common on the console. This made combat really dynamic and much easier than trying to tactically line up horizontal shots all the time, especially with all the strength and range upgrades that you could find. There didn't really seem to be any penalties for spamming attacks either, and with no ammo counter to deal with, it felt great to be liberal with my boomerangings. Getting my hands on the Power Blade was a real treat too, since at maximum power, it could go the length of the screen and plow right through any walls or other barriers in the way. It was completely overpowered, but it's not as if enemies put up much of a fight. Most of them were content to mind their own business and were pretty nonchalant for entities that were supposed to be trying to stop me. Other than a couple that caused me some mild strife, most of them felt more like stage dressings that could hurt you if you touched them on the way by. The amount of health you have also means that you can take quite a bludgeoning before dying, and as counterintuitive as this will sound, respawning monsters went a long way to cushion that risk. If you move off screen and come back, so do the enemies, but they also drop health pretty regularly. Right before fighting a boss, I'd take some time to farm up as many burgers out of them as I could before facing off with whatever was waiting for me beyond the end stage door. The checkpoints were also incredibly kind. If you're throwing down with a stage boss and perish, if you still have lives left, you're revived right back outside the door to try again right away. There's no working back through the stage from the beginning, and they even let you keep your keycard. This, along with unlimited continues, made my eventual win ironclad. I'm pretty sure the only people that needed to use the passwords here were kids that were getting called away for supper. Power Blade is completely beatable in a single sitting if you have a couple of hours to spare. I feel like my interest in Toki initially stemmed from my love of Adventure Island 2 on NES, because all caveman games must be created equal, right? I don't know what I was expecting here, but it certainly wasn't a story of a young man turned monkey on an adventure to hunt down a sorcerer and an invisible giant that abducted his girlfriend. With a lofty goal like that, thankfully the main character has a couple of methods to defend himself. For some reason, every living thing nearby has sided against him for no reason that's ever explained. You get to enjoy blasting fish, plants, and all kinds of beasts with a mouth-borne fireball attack that's described as feeling like gargling. This attack makes combat a cinch since it crosses the entire screen in many different directions. You can't shoot down, but you can fire upwards. There's no cooldown on it, so you can unleash as many projectiles as fast as you can mash the button. And if the base weapon wasn't good enough on its own, there are a handful of temporary upgrades that expand its range and strength. The only drawback is how microscopic the icons for these are. It really made them hard to see from the couch. Jumping on monsters was another option, and having 2 attacks made the split-second fighting decisions all that much easier. Enemies had this bad habit of popping into existence without any warning, and my first instinct was usually to jump out of the way rather than fire the gargle shot. Bouncing off of enemies also provides extra lift, so it was sometimes strategic to do it to snag things that were out of reach. With that said, there wasn't really much to do in terms of tracking down secrets, but it was really cool how often the levels switched from vertical to horizontal platforming and back again. I'll say that the vertical areas were my favorites, if only for the climbing animation. This is one of the jankiest looking character sprites I've ever seen. My neck is sore just looking at him. The bosses here were nothing exciting to write home about either. Even with the base weapon alone, they were all relatively easy to learn and take down in a couple of tries, if not the first. The main challenge with getting through this game was actually the health meter, since you can only get hit twice at the start. It's possible to lengthen it by picking up extensions by killing enemies, but these only last through the current continue. This makes Toki a game where you have to memorize the stage layouts and where enemies spawn to be able to plan ahead and not rush into danger. Learning all the ins and outs still wasn't enough sometimes, and some of my best runs got stamped out after making even a single small mistake. Taking a hit before a boss meant that I only had 1 additional hit left to do that entire fight, which proved to be quite the trial. My eventual winning run required the longest health bar possible, but it was more than doable for me on my first evening playing it. Whenever I felt my morale waning, I had this powerful and motivating message from the continue screen to push me through. In all seriousness though, it's delightfully silly, and Toki is more than manageable with a little practice and perseverance. I didn't really watch much of the Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers cartoon as a youngin', but the internet people tend to express their undying affection for the Disney afternoon phenomenon. My family didn't have anything beyond a basic cable package for most of my childhood, so back then I only had the pleasure of viewing whatever cartoons were available on YTV. I was more of a Darkwing Duck fan around that time, but I digress. My one big childhood memory with the Chipmunk duo was a Christmas cartoon where Mickey chops down their tree and they terrorize Pluto the entire time. When I first learned about the NES game, it was an obvious buy for me since I've loved pretty much everything Capcom I've ever played in the retro realm. As it turned out, this was also a very pleasant Capcom experience. You can play as either Chip or Dale here, and from what I can tell, there's really no difference between the two in how they control. This is an example of tiny characters in a normal human world, so the stage environments diverge quite a bit from the traditional forests, deserts, and caves you visit in other platformers. Lots of the locations are indoors and ooze that clutter aesthetic that lends itself well to some pretty innovative stage design where you can jump and scurry on just about anything in the background. Being able to tackle enemies and their attacks on several height tiers let me flip back and forth between fighting head-on or sidestepping the many violent and curiously pantsless enemies en route to the end of the stage. This variety really took the heat off of a couple of enemy types with wilier patterns. The fact that you can pick up and throw objects also creates a nice buffer zone between you and most of what you're defending against. So many other games force you to get right up into enemies' faces to jump on them or attack at close range, but here you can pick them off one by one from a safe distance. Hiding in these boxes was also a clever way to pad out the painfully short health meter, since you can only endure a couple of hits before dropping off the bottom of the screen to wherever dead chipmunks go. There's more than one way to regain health too, like finding acorns. Slowing down to rummage through a pile of crates and find extras was almost always worth it. Between this and a free life up for grabs at the end of every stage, Chippendale Rescue Rangers is more than generous. All of this extra staying power took the edge off of the looming plague of limited continues, but that's not to say that the gameplay itself was a walk through the park, since it did come with its fair share of shenanigans. A couple of the zones are best described as cold-blooded the first time through, like Zone H with all the crabs and their little projectiles that are perpetually in the way. Finding a safe path through here cost quite a few lives and a large strip of my pride, but the worst by far was the area with the disappearing blocks in Zone F. These platforms appear whenever you scroll the screen, so haphazardly jumping around while panicking the first few times I got here meant that the timing was never quite right. I fed the bottom of the screen more of its favorite snacks. The most merciful aspect of this game is that you can actually pick and choose which levels you bother with, since there are a couple of branching paths on the overworld map screen. This element of choice tailors the experience to be as difficult or as easy as you please. My playthrough included all of the stages to get a feel for the entire game, but if there's a particular point in this adventure where you find yourself dropping the ball too much, there's sometimes an option to bypass it. This is definitely a title I can see myself picking up again, or even trying out the 2-player co-op sometime. Of all of the cartoon cats that littered my childhood, Garfield was my favorite by far. The Halloween special is still one of my go-to holiday movies, but unfortunately, most of his games spanning many console generations aren't the greatest way to spend an afternoon. Felix the Cat didn't cross my airwaves nearly as often as a kid, but the NES game always interested me since it looked like some good wholesome fun. I'll get my one major complaint out of the way here. The music has a bit of awfulness to it. The actual melodies are fine, but there's something about the instrumentation that sounds slightly out of tune, transforming the otherwise bouncy and energetic soundtrack into something rather grating. On the bright side, it imparts a bit of whimsy on an otherwise generic story where you play as Felix on a mission to rescue his girlfriend, Kitty Cat. She's been kidnapped by the professor who's after Felix's bag of tricks, and considering how many weapons are in there, I can understand why any villain would want it. There's a punching glove at the low end of the murder scale, but there's also a car with a lethal honk, and quite a few armored vehicles to take out the local wildlife with. Pesky birds or jellyfish stand no chance against Felix's bag of artillery. There are a couple of stage types here. The first are the typical platforming ones that weren't all bright and sunny like the clear blue skies and some of the stages would have you believe. Obstacles and enemies were tricky to avoid due to the camera often panning up and away from the ground. There were unfair moments where even the quickest reaction times weren't enough to anticipate stuff just out of view, but thankfully these situations were quite rare. Other levels where you fly or travel underwater were comparatively easy to work through. At a first glance, there might seem to be a lot going on in these areas, but there was always a path with virtually no enemies or obstacles to find. When you remove nearly all possibilities for damage and also take away the risks that come with careful jumps since you can just float on through, these levels pose practically no threat. When clumsiness did overtake me, the grace of a health bar was very appreciated. While it's not a health meter in the traditional sense, Felix's attack can be upgraded a couple of times, with every hit reverting his weapon to a weaker and weaker form until he dies. Getting downgraded like this might seem punishing, but it's actually easy enough to get powered back up again. Just under the surface, this game's a collectathon. Gathering Felix heads gets you a heart from Kitty that upgrades the attack, and picking up bottles of milk, which are also derived from cat heads somehow, extends the timer in the corner. As long as you keep moving, you can maintain your current weapon indefinitely as long as you don't get hit. I thought the imposed time limit would make it way harder to hang on to the better transformations, but there's so many noggins everywhere that just going through the stages at my own leisurely pace was plenty to keep that counter full. It wouldn't surprise me if people played through this whole game without ever realizing there was a timer at all. That's how lenient it was. And I haven't even mentioned the bonus rooms yet. Taking a trip down a magic bag sends you to even more opportunities to pick up even more heads. Needless to say, if I ever lost a life, it was by my own folly. If you're wondering if there was any real trouble from boss encounters here, the answer is a resounding no. These tiffs were nothing much to contend with, since your foes only move back and forth and occasionally throw something. Even with the lowest weapon form, these weren't really any problem to defeat. I think the worst threat that this game could conjure up was the menacing professor face in the sky, glaring away while players danced around his evil traps. I'd be mad too if I went through the trouble to make someone's life miserable, and they just coasted right on through all of it. I don't know what it is about ninja games and their reputations for being impossible, but Shadow of the Ninja isn't really like its brethren on the NES. On a list of easier games for the system, it comes in as one of the more trying titles for sure, but since I was able to see its majestic ending in a couple of hours, it makes the cut. The story takes place in 2029, where ninjas have infiltrated the strongholds of an evil empire being led by a terrible fellow named Garuda in the United States of America. You can choose between two ninja characters to play as, with their only real distinguishing feature being the outfit design and color. My preference leaned heavily towards the female character, since her orange clothing was much more vibrant against the darker backgrounds. The blue the male ninja wore was the same as many of the enemies, which confused the heck out of me when the action got too intense. I don't know if other people ever lose track of their sprite in video games, but this was definitely a problem for me. The character control was tight and measured, which made battling Garuda's droves of minions that much easier. Each stage introduced a few new enemies to contend with, giving these locations a slightly different flavor. All of this translated into nice incremental increases in challenge the entire way through. Each attempt was a learning experience, and a little easier than the last by design. Another big contributor to the excellent pacing was that enemies always drop the same items when they're killed. Whether it was health, main weapons, or sub-weapons, after seeing them the first time, it was always obvious where these things could be found again. This eliminated much of the uncertainty that would come up from farming enemy respawns hoping for a preferred weapon drop, and also meant that accidentally picking up the wrong weapon wasn't the end of the world either. A replacement was typically only a few screens away, and in my case, I overwhelmingly preferred the sickle chain over the sword. The extra bit of range it provided put it head and shoulders above the katana, even if it wasn't quite as powerful. The most daunting thing about Shadow of the Ninja is that it has limited continues, but they're not actually continues at all. They're really more like lives. If you burn through the entire health bar or get wrecked falling into a pit, you're directed to a continue screen rather than seeing a life counter tick down. While this is a pretty restrictive feature, there are quite a few aspects of the stages that make this game a lot gentler than it may appear. For one, the bottom of the screen isn't always death. Making a misstep in a vertical section just drops you back in the level rather than killing you right away, though there still are plenty of regular pits to chow down those continues quickly. The health bar is long-lasting too. If you get pushed around too much, health drops are not only predictably located as I mentioned earlier, but frequent. There are usually at least 1 or 2 refills in each stage, and all said, there aren't really that many stages to get through. It only took me a couple of times through the first few levels to develop a plan and execute it for every future run, tweaking and improving things along the way. Now, I'd be lying if I said that there weren't some absolutely grueling aspects, like this yellow boss at the top of a tower whose movement is mostly unpredictable. There was not one attempt made where I didn't lose a life to him. A lot of the bosses necessitate split-second reactions to meet with success, though victory was far from feeling out of reach. The levels also had some nasty bits, like this climb where enemies straight up impede your next jump without any discernible pattern. They just stick out their stupid little swords indefinitely, with the bottom of the screen consuming all your hopes and dreams while you helplessly wait. Even though a few parts of Shadow of the Ninja put me through the ringer, I still think it's a great game that imparts a lot of satisfaction to players striving to see the next level. I got my VHS copy of The Little Mermaid for my birthday when I was little, and it didn't take long for it to become one of those movies I watched on repeat, often while working on the corresponding giant puzzle. While I don't remember exactly when I got my hands on the NES game, I do remember playing it so much that it was one of the first that I ever finished. It's a short and sweet entry into the NES library that is extremely approachable for just about anyone. The story takes you on a strange alternative telling of the movie's plot where Ariel is living on land and madly in love with Eric when her friends ask her for help. Apparently, Ursula's charmed all of the sea life to do her evil bidding, and they need Ariel to go back to the waters to stop her. The funny part is that in this version of the tale, Eric supposedly never knew that Ariel was a mermaid before this very moment, and she just tells him she's leaving despite his protests. His face in this cutscene is a mix of pure shock and horror. Something about it really makes me laugh. Anyway, you get to play as Ariel in mermaid form. The main idea here is swimming for the end of this stage while trapping and disposing of the various creatures that have been called to the dark side. In its lowest form, the bubble attack will stun most enemies, but it takes 2 successful connections to actually get them into a bubble to throw them around. You can just launch them away into oblivion or use them to fight other enemies, making the combat system pretty versatile. This is also a great excuse to practice your basketball skills and get rewarded with dinglehoppers and snarfblats for those precious points. There's a weapon upgrade system available if you open up chests with shells. Green and red pearls increase the range and power of the attack respectively, and if you die, you lose all of those advantages and go back to the base bubble attack. The game does get a bit tricksy in the later stages by baiting you to open chests with nothing inside, but victory is more than achievable with the lowest form of the weapon. The levels are quite short and simple to work through, with the exception of one area that requires a bit of trial and error in a door maze of sorts. The others are very low on the challenge scale and only have you plodding along on the one and only path forward. One big factor that makes things easy is the lack of any actual platforming skill being required here. Because you swim everywhere and your only time on land is spent flopping around for a few seconds as more of a novelty than anything else, there are no clinch-worthy jumps that would send you tumbling to your death like you might experience where gravity has consequences. There's a bit of environmental variety, or whether you're swimming horizontally or vertically, but other than fish and shelled beasts that charge at you once in a while, there's not much else threatening your existence, leaving you to enjoy the 8-bit wonders under the sea. Coming in as the easiest game on this list without a doubt, The Little Mermaid is a fun one to throw on once in a while to hear the excellent soundtrack and relive a little slice of childhood. The monster in my pocket toy craze flew right over my head as a kid, with my initial interest in the NES game blooming much later in life when I spotted someone playing through it online. The little monsters running around oversized environments teleported me right back to fumbling my way through Giant Land in Super Mario Bros. 3. There was something so magical to me about being tiny in a normal-sized world, so naturally I had to pick this up and try it for myself. I'll be completely honest here, I didn't love this one. I still think it's worth mentioning since it more than qualifies as an easy NES game, but it was probably the least engaging one on this list for me for a couple of reasons that I'll get into here. When you strip away the neat setting, Monster in My Pocket's actually a very typical platformer without much in the way of bells or whistles. If you're going the single-player route, you can pick your favorite of 2 playable characters. Either a monster that accidentally shrunk his clothes in the dryer, or a vampire that gets to flaunt his very best and most stylish outfit. They both control and attack exactly the same despite the manual describing them differently, eliminating any chance of meaningful replay value. The story premise involves hunting down a group of evil monsters that have risen up against your group of goody-goody monsters that are living out their days in Los Angeles after a freak natural disaster. If you're scratching your head and wondering what the heck I'm talking about, even the manual says that you shouldn't think too hard about how all of this is possible. If the writers couldn't be bothered to care about it, we shouldn't either. Part of what makes this game lean so heavily to the easy side is how short its playtime is. There's just over a handful of stages, with the only real variety coming from the charming changes in scenery. If you ignore all that, the levels are relatively uneventful saunters from one end to the other without much blocking the way other than those bad monsters I mentioned. The level layouts are pretty benign, with the majority of travel taking place on solid ground. There was one area with a pretty mean cocktail of timed enemies, knockback, and instant death pits, but this was a small exception to what is otherwise a very friendly landscape for a platforming game. The difficulty melts away when platforming finesse is barely required. One thing to love was how much you could actually interact with stuff in the background. There were obvious things to jump on like dishes, but you could also find alternative paths above or below you by way of other objects that were just lying around. There weren't really any power-ups to discover, and there were enough health pickups along the main stretch that I wasn't compelled to scrounge around looking for extras. Occasionally, my curiosity did get the best of me, but exploring never really paid off. I'm curious to know if anyone out there came across any worthwhile secrets. Let me know in the comments. The biggest advantage multi-tiered levels imparted was the ability to ignore many enemies completely, since the double jump move was ridiculously overpowered. It's possible to clear nearly the entire screen's height with it, rendering most enemy attacks moot. Getting out of their way or jumping up to another floor above helped to extend that little tiny pack of chiclets they call a health meter. Dodging virtually everything the game hurtled at me didn't really seem fair for the bad guys, but I'm sure they were just doing their best. And by their best, I mean simply existing in most cases, since the enemy monsters weren't really all that rambunctious. You had your punchers, your shooters, your swoopers, and your roasters. Many of them just tore through the screen on their way to wherever they were going and paid no attention to the main character. The ones that did chase you though? Oh boy. Occupying their rightful place at the top of the meanness list were some dragons that lived up to their reputation as being some absolute misery incarnate. Their lightning bolts seemed impossible to dodge, and the only strategy that worked some of the time was running and jumping around like a fool while hoping they'd miss me. Trying to fight them head-on wasn't worth the amount of damage they dished out, since they seemed to take a million hits to kill. They were actually way worse than some of the bosses, which were mostly pushovers. There's some neat strategy that was implemented into these encounters, but it only took a few moments of observing to figure out the majority of them. When death did find me, the consequences were pretty light. Monster in My Pocket's greatest kindness is that if you die at any time, you reappear exactly where you were with tons of invincibility frames to work with. The only thing that really threatened a successful run was the finite number of continues, but even still, I made it to the final boss on my first attempt through the game in about 30 minutes and beat it on my second playthrough. If you're looking for a workout, this game's barely gonna make you break a sweat. I would love to know if you've played any of these games and what you thought of them. If there are any others you'd put on a list like this or some you'd remove, please let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching.